Okay. Uh, So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, by overturning the Missouri Compromise and saying that this territory that used to be guaranteed as free is now going to be up for grabs via popular sovereignty, sets off this bloody event known as Bleeding Kansas. Very good. And as you were leaving yesterday, I was trying to describe the Lee-Compton Constitution and how it came to be, right? So as both the North free soil people and the South pro-slaverites continue to send people into Kansas, it's not long before Kansas has enough people to apply for statehood. So when it does, then it holds a vote to try to figure out should they frame their constitution to exclude or include slavery. But there is absolute overt fraud on the behalf of the pro-slaverites, right? They are like, okay, not literally busing in, they don't have buses, but they are wagoning in people from Missouri and Arkansas to take part in this vote, even though they are not residents of this new territory. And it's clear that they're going to rig the election. So most of the free soilers just stay home, right? They boycott the election, they protest, but as we recall yesterday, when you boycott an election, you lose. That's kind of how it works. If you don't vote in an election, is that you definitely don't win. So the vote comes through overwhelmingly in favor of slavery through like a combination of fraud and like boycotting free soilers. And so they very hurriedly like get together a constitutional convention at Lee-Compton, Kansas. They write a constitution that says, yes, we want to be slaves or have a slave state. And they send it off to Washington, D.C., where the president really wants to accept it and just like put the whole Kansas thing to bed. You know, he sort of thought like, well, if we could just sort of get this Kansas, drama out of the way, then Kansas will go back to normal. They'll stop killing each other, and we can all sort of like get some sleep. But the free soilers in Congress were so horrified by the like clear fraud that has occurred that they finally staged enough of a protest. The Lee-Compton Constitution is sent back. Kansas goes back into like a bloody civil war until the actual civil war happens, and it won't really be resolved until after the war itself. So shortly after this, we have the Brooks-Sumner affair. So the next year, this guy, who looks so, sort of romanticized there. This is Senator Sumner, and he had given a speech the day before about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He also hated the Kansas-Nebraska Act, felt like it was an abomination and had like ruined American government and had caused all these problems. So he's giving this speech about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and like in the 19th century, they use pretty flowery language. So what he says is he's talking about slavery as the great harlot. You guys know what a harlot is? It's a lady of the night. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, so he calls slavery the great harlot, and he's basically saying that the South is prostituting itself for slavery, like is allowing like itself to sort of whatever. Well, anyway, this is mildly offensive language, even today, even by today's standards. And he calls out by name several senators who like participated in the Kansas-Nebraska Act and says like that they are participating in this, including the uncle of this guy, Representative Brooks. So Brooks hears about the speech. He's in the House of Representatives, not the Senate. But Brooks hears about the speech, and so comes the next day, like angry. He feels like his uncle's good name has been besmirched. So he corners Sumner and then like beats him with his cane. He breaks his cane in the process of the beating, and Sumner is so injured, he has brain damage, he has to take 2 years off to recuperate before he can come back to Congress. So he like this is no trivial injury. This is a pretty big deal. Beaten on the floor of the Senate, violence erupting on the floor of the U.S. Capitol. This is a pretty big deal. Well, Brooks is censured by the House of Representatives. They like basically like write a naughty note in his file, and say like darn you. So he resigns. He's from South Carolina. Did I mention that? He would be from South Carolina, don't you know? He's from South Carolina. He goes back home to South Carolina where they hold a special election, like to fill his seat, where he is re-elected to his own seat by a landslide vote. And the South Carolinians, they send him more than 100 replacement canes to replace the one that he broke, including 3 of them that were gold-plated and inscribed with various, like, to defend our honor or whatever. So if this helps you to understand, like, the kind of cultural divide that is occurring right now, I think that is a good illustration. Like, things are going, like, pretty bad. But it gets worse. It gets worse. So while all this is going on, the Whigs have dissolved, right? Remember, the last major Whig president failed to take a strong stance on slavery. It was just Zachary Taylor. He was like, yay, America, we won the war, and didn't take a stance on slavery. Didn't go well for him. Slavery is the issue people care about. So nobody's willing to support a candidate who doesn't take a stance. So the Whigs have kind of dissolved, and so we see a small but growing movement in the West, centered around the Great Lakes region, this new party called the Republican Party. And they're going to be kind of gathering individuals from the sort of leftovers of the Whig Party, some free soilers, abolitionists, the know-nothings, a few of the remnants of the anti-Mason Party, all kinds of different people, most of whom kind of united around the idea that, like, westward expansion was good, the American system had been good, like, specialization was good, and the platform will very clearly articulate that we should stop the expansion of slavery. Does that mean abolish slavery? No, the Republicans were not about abolishing slavery. These are not, like, civil rights advocates. They are arguing that we should no longer allow slavery to expand, so it ends the expansion of slavery. Now, as Bleeding Kansas gets worse, the Republicans begin to gain more and more supporters, because there are even now Northern Democrats who feel frustrated that this Kansas-Nebraska Act has caused such trouble. They're sort of defecting from the Democratic Party in the North. So the Republican Party is going to gain support over the course of this time. But in 1856, the Republican Party is still very weak. And so although they do run a presidential candidate, this guy, John C. Fremont, he will not win. He doesn't get hardly any votes at all. Instead, it's going to be Democrat James Buchanan who will be successful. He's basically campaigning on the fact that we should abide by the Compromise of 1850. That this was the great thing that our nation needs to focus on and be united around. So he wins a narrow victory, but it's clear the Republicans are going to be an important force in politics going forward. Then in 1857, stuff gets real bad. And I would like to introduce you to a potential rival for the worst villain of the antebellum period, rivaling Stephen Douglas. It's this guy. Well, that's a caricature of him. Roger B. Taney. Taney is spelled T-A-N-E-Y. Roger B. Taney. Taney is the Supreme Court Chief Justice at the time, and he is going to be on the bench when the court case Dred Scott versus Sanford comes before the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, Dred Scott had been was a slave, and his owner had been a member of the U.S. military, and as a member of the military had been traveling around the country his whole life and taking Dred Scott, his slave, with him. He'd gone to Illinois, he'd been out to Indian Territory, he'd been to Massachusetts, he'd been all over the place as part of his military service. Now, what's interesting about all these places? Those are free states and territories, right? So he's traveled with his slave to all these free states and territories. But Dred Scott never tried to escape, never did anything, because Dred Scott liked his master. His master was a nice guy, and was under the assumption that when his master died, he would give Scott and his wife their manumission papers. He would free them. But it didn't happen that way. When his owner died, he willed them and said to a friend or a cousin or a sister-in-law, something doesn't matter. Anyway, he wills them to somebody else. And now Dred Scott's mad. He's going, wait a minute, I thought I was going to get my freedom. And so Dred Scott then files suit, saying that I deserve my freedom. I was in a free state. That means that while I was there, I was free, because slavery was illegal in that state. So while I was there, I was free. And therefore, for my master to have brought me back to a slave state was kidnapping, right? It was unlawful detention, because I should not have been forced to come back to a slave state. So I should have been free. I should get freedom. Well, Roger B. Taney is a horrible excuse for a human being, because what he does is he takes this case, and rather than simply answering the question, and come on, y'all, it's like antebellum America. Do we really expect him to free the slave? No. So he could have just said, no, sorry, you're in a slave state, you're a slave. But he didn't stop there. Taney continued. So first he says, no, you're not free. Then he says, also, because you're not white, you're not a U.S. citizen, and you can't sue in U.S. courts. So nobody but white people can be U.S. citizens, according to Roger B. Taney. Then he says, oh yeah, and besides not being a citizen, you are no more significant than property in terms of owning a cow or a chair or a dresser. You're just property. And property, let me remind you, is protected by the Fifth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It guarantees the right to life, liberty, and property, unless due process of the law deigns for them to be removed. So Taney then goes on to say, so therefore, no state can ban slavery. No state can ban slavery, because that would then violate slave owners' property rights by banning them, preventing them from taking their property when they travel. Like, if somebody from Mississippi wants to move to Massachusetts and they own some tables and chairs, The state of Massachusetts can't forbid them from owning tables and chairs and bringing them with them when they move. In the same way, no more can the state of Massachusetts ban you from bringing your slaves. Slavery must be legal in every state because property is protected by that Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Now, I'd like for you to take a moment to think about this. Remember, the North has just recently been subjected to the Fugitive Slave Act, right? Where now they've been asked to be like accomplices in returning escaped slaves to the South. But now, to add insult to injury, Taney is going to say in the Dred Scott decision that all of the northern states have to not just return escaped slaves, but have to allow and protect slavery themselves. This is absolutely horrifying to many Northerners and really begins to strain the unity of the Democratic Party because Northern Democrats are furious about this, while Southern Democrats are practically jubilant, right? Remember, do you guys remember, those of you who were the South, when we did this on Tuesday? Remember how bad that felt? Losing every single time? Well, imagine if all of a sudden the Supreme Court hands you a victory on a silver platter. Here you go. Every single state in the country is slave now. Don't worry about all the rest of that. You all have to be slave states. The South is jubilant. So we begin to see cracks in the Democratic Party, which are only going to get worse in the Senate race of 1858. So in 1858, Stephen Douglas is running to be the U.S. Senator from Illinois. And he's going to come up against a challenger, you might recognize him, a young Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln, that's right. So Abraham Lincoln, he is a Republican, and he's challenging Douglas for this Senate seat. And they're going to go on a series of debates, the so-called Lincoln-Douglas debates. And they're going to travel all around Illinois to different cities. They'll hold like big public debates. Y'all, these debates lasted hours, like 4 or 5 hours worth of them standing up and talking back and forth at each other. You think that 90-minute presidential debates these days are long? Like, I just want you, they did like 12 multi-hour debates. So let's just go there. Yes?
The way that it works is basically one guy gets to talk for like 2 hours and pose a question to the other guy, and then the other guy answers the question for 2 hours, and it goes on like that, like the whole time.
Isn't that exciting? Don't you wish you could be there? No air conditioning. Don't forget that part. Okay, so they go on this series of debates, and at one particular debate in a city called Freeport, so in Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln is going to back his competitor into a corner because remember, this is 1858. Douglas is running for the U.S. Senate, but what does he really want? He really wants to be the president, right? But he has to wait, yeah, because the presidential election isn't going to be until 1816. So Douglas really wants the presidency, and that means that what has he been trying to do this whole time? Make both the North and the South happy, right? He's a Democrat trying to keep his national appeal. So Lincoln backs him into a corner. He says, "Okay, Mr. Senator, Justice Taney says that no state can be a free state. Do you agree? Do you agree that every northern state has to accept slavery?" And Douglas is going, I don't know what to say, because I'm going to make somebody mad no matter what he does. So he tries to tiptoe, and he does a decent job, but he still fails. But he tries, so here's what he says. He said, and this is called the Freeport Doctrine. So what he says becomes known as the Freeport Doctrine. And that's what he says. He says, okay, listen. Well, no, northern states can't ban slavery because the Supreme Court says so. But if a northern state didn't want to have slavery in its territory, then they could simply refuse to pass laws protecting slavery. So, for example, if Massachusetts doesn't want slaves in its territory, then Massachusetts could pass laws that say things like anyone who abuses their property, like cattle or slaves or otherwise, can be fined. So, like anyone who beat their slaves could be fined. Or Massachusetts could pass laws, that made it a crime to report someone as a fugitive or something like that. They could pass laws that no slave owner would want to be in that state because slavery then would not be protected. And so Douglas is basically saying that northern states, they can't ban slavery, but they can effectively keep slaves out of their territory by just refusing to protect slavery, and then no northerner is going to move there. Well, how does the North feel about this, those northern Democrats? They like it. Northern Democrats are like, cool, that's a good solution. Thanks, Stephen Douglas, for sorting that out for us. We appreciate that. But the Southern Democrats, Oh, heck no, right? Like, they are absolutely not about it, because they feel like, first of all, pause. Are any Southerners, like, actually planning on moving their plantations to Massachusetts? No, but it's the principle of the thing, right? They've been taking loss after loss after loss, and this is a chance for them to be able to say, no, northern states, you have to do what we like. You can't undermine us. And so they're really upset about this. So Douglas has lost the Democratic Party. And after this, the Democratic Party will very clearly split, north and south. It only gets worse. The next year, John Brown, remember him? He took his sons to Kansas, and at Potawatomi Creek, they hacked to death a whole family worth of pro-slavery people. Yeah? Well, John Brown has visions. And in his visions, he believes that God is telling him that the way to end slavery is going to be bloody uprising. So he takes his sons, again, this time they go to a place called Harper's Ferry. It's in present-day West Virginia, but that time it was Virginia. Takes them to Harper's Ferry with a couple of escaped slaves and some free blacks, and their goal is to capture the arsenal. It's a big building full of weapons, basically. To capture the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And they thought that once they captured it, that all the slaves in the area would rise up against their masters, and they would have this big slave rebellion. They would overthrow all the plantation owners through this massive uprising. Well, it fails because nobody rises up. So they capture the arsenal, but then are quickly surrounded by the U.S. Army, led by a young officer named Robert E. Lee. He's captured. A quick trial is held, and a few weeks later he's executed. On the day of the execution, all across the North, flags are flown in half-staff, church bells ring, people are in open mourning, they wear black in public. Can you imagine what that feels like for the South? The South is basically thinking, wait a minute, the North is mourning the execution of a criminal who was trying to incite a violent uprising to murder us in our beds? It'll be a little bit like, you guys remember the San Bernardino shooting, the couple who carried out that act of terrorism just last year? And they were killed in a shootout with the police, right, as they were finally found. It would be a little bit like, what if half the country was sad that the couple had been killed in that shootout? What if they mourned and protested, how dare the police kill those people, and we should be celebrating their lives, or they were standing, can you imagine how we would be branding them as un-American? How dare you? Do you hate us? This is how people in the South were feeling after the execution of John Brown. Big cultural divide. Now comes 1860. I told you the Democratic Party has split, right? The Northern Democrats will stick with their guy Stephen Douglas, but he hasn't got a chance because he's only got the North. The Southern Democrats will instead nominate this guy, John Breckinridge, who has a super awesome mustache. But John Breckinridge only has support in the South. There's this Constitutional Union Party guy, his name is John Bell. His whole platform is basically la, 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 let's pretend we all love each other and hold hands and sing Kumbaya and go back to 1820. Can we just not have a war? That's not working. And then we've got Abraham Lincoln, the Republican. Abraham Lincoln is literally only on the ballot in the northern states. Not a single southern state even has Lincoln on the ballot. But he wins the election anyway. So this is what the Electoral College map looks like. He gets 180 electoral votes out of a total of 303. John Breckinridge comes in close. He's a southern guy, right? He wins every single southern state except for Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. But it's not enough. And the South takes one look at this map, and they're going, this is bad news for us. So immediately, well, almost immediately, within a month, South Carolina secedes. Now remember, the election happened in November, but Lincoln won't be inaugurated until March of 1861. So before Lincoln even takes office, South Carolina basically says, see ya, and they secede. They leave the Union. Shortly after that, before Lincoln is even inaugurated, within the next couple of months, the other lower southern states secede. South Carolina first, then Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. This is the lower South. I'll skip forward and show you a map really quickly. These are the green states here. The lower South secedes before Lincoln is even elected. Meanwhile, they're going to create a constitution that looks a whole lot for this Confederate States of America. The CSA is the name of their country. The Confederate States of America. They make it a really moderate constitution. It's modeled almost identically after the U.S. Constitution. They named Jefferson Davis a super moderate. In fact, he had opposed secession prior to the vote being taken. Once the South secedes, he stays with the state. But he's a moderate, he's appointed, and the South really thought that the northern states would join. And all right, I guess we will start with Fort Sumter on Monday and see if we can fight the Civil War in 2 days. You'll have a good weekend.